Most people believe they understand the cosmic order: God on the throne, angels on the lower rungs, humanity at the bottom, looking up. Even serious seekers who study ancient wisdom tend to accept that ladder as the default map of reality. But the earliest Gnostic manuscripts don't just challenge that map, they shatter it. In 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a hidden library of texts resurfaced from the sand, and inside it, the secret book of John opens a door most traditions never wanted you to find. It describes a truth so unsettling that the familiar creator of Genesis, Yahweh himself, is portrayed as a distant echo, a lesser power standing far below something infinitely more fundamental. The Gnostics name that ultimate source the monad, the invisible spirit beyond form, beyond titles, beyond every hierarchy you've ever been taught to obey. And then the Gospel of the Egyptians pushes the shock even further, claiming that every creator god, including the one responsible for the physical universe you wake up in every day, is not the origin at all, but an emanation flowing out from that incomprehensible source. This wasn't casual speculation or spiritual fan fiction. These were guarded revelations, copied, circulated, and then buried, as if someone feared what would happen if ordinary people read them and recognized themselves in the implications. Because if the monad is real, then the questions you've carried in silence, why religion feels incomplete, why God sometimes seems too human, why you sense a presence beyond doctrine, aren't doubts, they're signals. And in the next moments, you're going to see the hidden cosmic structure these manuscripts outline. A complete map that can finally connect the spiritual pieces you've always felt were missing into one coherent system you can actually understand. Most of your life, you've been handed a map and told it's the world itself, and the strange ache you feel when the map doesn't match your lived experience has been treated like a personal flaw instead of a clue. So, if you felt something click a moment ago when I promised a coherent system, you could actually understand. Stay with that feeling, because what the Gnostic manuscripts describe isn't a new belief to adopt. It's a hidden lens that makes familiar things look unfamiliar again, like turning a key in a lock you didn't even know was on your own door. Here's the big idea that changes the emotional gravity of everything. What if the deepest reality isn't a someone watching you from above, but a kind of boundless presence that everything happens inside of, including every god name you've ever been taught to fear, obey, or worship? The secret book of John, found among the Nag Hammadi library, begins in a way that feels like a quiet act of rebellion against the usual story. Not in the beginning, but before beginning could even be a concept, before time had a first tick, before existence could raise its hand and say, I am. There is what it calls the monad, the invisible spirit, the ultimate source so far beyond categories that even calling it source is already a compromise. And this is where your mind will want to grab something familiar, because your mind survives by naming, by shaping, by turning mystery into manageable objects. But the monad is described as the place where that instinct runs out of fuel, not a throne, not a face, not a personality with mood swings, not a cosmic judge keeping score, not even a being in the way we use that word. The Apocryphon of John strains the language on purpose, saying it is not corporeal and not incorporeal, not large and not small, impossible to measure in quantity or quality, not because the writers were being poetic for drama, but because they were pointing at something that, by its nature, doesn't fit inside the human method of understanding. Think about the gods you've heard of across cultures, thunder throwers and lawgivers and prophet speakers, even the more abstract ideas of divine consciousness. They still have traits, behaviors, preferences, a recognizable shape in the imagination. The monad, in these texts, has none of that, and that absence is not emptiness in the depressed sense. It's more like standing at the edge of the ocean at night and realizing the horizon isn't a line you can reach, it's the limit of how far your eyes can translate what's there. The Gnostic writers didn't seem interested in arguing with anyone else's religion as much as they were interested in removing a subtle spell, the spell of anthropomorphism, the habit of painting the infinite with human features so we can feel in control of it. In Genesis, you meet a God who speaks, gets angry, walks in a garden, negotiates, punishes. That can be comforting because it's relatable, but it can also be unsettling because it's too relatable. The Gnostic lens doesn't mock that. It simply slides a curtain aside and whispers, what if you've been relating to a reflection, not the sun? In this view, the monad doesn't speak because it is the stillness out of which all speaking arises. It doesn't create the way a craftsman assembles a product, because it is the spaciousness in which creation appears, the field in which anything that could be called a universe is able to show up at all. If you want an intimate way to feel what they were gesturing toward, don't look outward first. Look inward. Notice how thoughts appear in you. A thought shows up like a spark, then it fades. But something in you was present before the thought arrived, present while it lasted, present when it disappeared. That background isn't created by the thoughts. The thoughts are held by it. Now imagine awareness with no thoughts at all, no images, no story, no commentary, not blank in a dead way, but clear in a living way, infinite and unowned. That's the kind of doorway these texts are pointing at when they speak of the monad. They describe it with 5 qualities that aren't meant to be memorized like doctrine, but felt like a dismantling of your usual habits of worship. First, formless, not merely invisible, but beyond the entire category of form, like asking what shape the act of seeing has. Second, limitless, not very big, but without boundary, not located inside space, because space itself is pictured as something that appears within it. Third, and this is the one that stings the ego, unknowable. The Gospel of the Egyptians says no power can know it, and you can hear in that line a kind of spiritual humility that doesn't crush you, it frees you. Because if the ultimate cannot be owned by the mind, then your worth can't depend on your mental certainty. Fourth, invisible light, not ordinary brightness, but the kind of light that makes all perception possible while remaining itself unseen, like awareness, illuminating every experience without becoming an object inside the experience. And fifth, the root of all roots, not the first item in a chain, but that from which the possibility of chains, sequences, hierarchies, and beginnings can arise. These aren't just cosmic trivia, they hit your daily life where it hurts. Because, if ultimate reality is like this, then all the projections you've placed onto God begin to loosen. Your fear of disappointing it, your belief that you're being constantly evaluated, the sense that you must earn access through the right words, the right rituals, the right intermediaries. You can't bargain with the monad the way you bargain with a person. You can't flatter it. You can't threaten it with doubt. You can't get on its good side. It isn't a judge waiting behind the curtain, because judgment itself is something that arises inside the field it is. And notice what happens emotionally when you even entertain that possibility. A strange quiet can open up, like taking off a heavy costume you didn't realize you'd been wearing since childhood. At the same time, another part of you might resist, because a personal God is easier to negotiate with than an infinite mystery. A personal God can be persuaded, appeased, blamed. The monad cannot be manipulated, and that can feel like losing control, until you realize you were never in control anyway, only anxious. This is one reason these teachings could feel dangerous to institutions. When ultimate reality has no personality issuing commands, the machinery built around interpreting those commands starts to look optional. And when that machinery looks optional, people start listening for something more direct inside themselves. You can feel why this was labeled forbidden knowledge, why communities associated with this way of seeing were pressured, why texts were hidden and buried, why certain voices were called heretical, because a spirituality built on inner recognition is harder to manage than a spirituality built on external permission. But keep this gentle. The point isn't to attack anyone's faith, it's to notice how easily fear-based authority can grow in the shadow of mystery. And the Nag Hammadi discovery in 1945 matters here, not because it proves anything, but because it reintroduces a buried conversation. What if the most important spiritual movement is not obedience, but awakening? Here's where the mythic story turns from pure silence into the first ripple. Because the Gnostic texts don't stop at saying the monad is beyond. They describe how the ungraspable becomes, in a sense, knowable without ceasing to be ungraspable. Not by issuing a command like, "Let there be light," but by an event more subtle, self-recognition. Picture a perfectly still pond. There is only the surface and the depth, no disturbance. Then, in the stillness, a reflection appears, not as a separate object, but as the pond's own surface revealing the pond to itself. That's the kind of image the secret book of John evokes when it says the monad looked into its pure light and that thought became a reality. This is not creation as a king ordering servants. This is emanation, overflow, the first differentiation within absolute unity. And that first differentiation has a name, Barbelo. The texts call Barbelo the first thought, the primal mirror, the place where the invisible spirit becomes, for the first time, a kind of presence that can be related to. Barbelo is described with titles that sound paradoxical because they're trying to point beyond gender and beyond human categories. Mother, Father, Womb of the Light, the Firstborn. Not because the writers were confused, but because they were trying to express a principle that holds both receptivity and expression at once, like an inhale and an exhale that are not enemies, but a single breath. If the monad is the unfathomable depth, Barbelo is the first surface on which that depth becomes luminous to itself. And here's the intimate part. This isn't just cosmic theater. The relationship between the monad and Barbelo is offered as a pattern you can sense in your own consciousness. There is in you a silent field, and there is in you a first thought, a first shimmer of awareness, recognizing itself. Every time you suddenly catch yourself being aware, every time you step back from the storm of your mind and feel that you are the space holding it, you are tasting the same movement, scaled down into human experience. The tripartite tractate describes Barbelo as knowing the Father perfectly, while also being the image through which all things come to know the Father. In other words, Barbelo is both receiver and transmitter, mirror and doorway. The texts speak of 5 lights associated with this first emanation, qualities like thought, foreknowledge, incorruptibility, eternal life, and truth, not as trophies awarded by a superior, but as the natural facets of the source becoming distinguishable without becoming divided. And if you're listening closely, you can already feel the implication pressing on your ribs. What you call spiritual growth might not be you climbing up to something far away, but you becoming a clearer receiver of what's already here, a more transparent transmitter of what you already are. This is the foundation of the whole cosmology to come, not separation, but recognition, not a distant God demanding loyalty, but an ultimate source expressing itself in layers of consciousness, each layer carrying a trace of the original light. And once you feel that first ripple, once you understand why the Gnostics framed reality as emanation rather than command, you're ready to enter the next chambers of this hidden map, where the fullness begins to unfold into distinct powers, and where a single twist in the story introduces the tension that makes your own inner life, your confusion and longing, and sudden flashes of insight, feel less like random chaos and more like a message addressed to you personally. If part 1 felt like standing in a dark room and suddenly realizing the darkness is not an enemy but a vast, quiet space holding everything, then part 2 is the moment your eyes adjust and you begin to see shapes moving inside that space, not as threats, but as patterns, living architecture. Because in the Gnostic imagination, once the first ripple appears as barbello, reality doesn't get built like a machine. It unfolds like a song learning its own melody, a cascade of awareness stepping into recognizable facets without ever fully breaking from its source. The ancient texts call these facets aeons, and the realm where they shimmer together is the pleroma, the fullness. Try not to picture it like a place with coordinates. Picture it like the total range of light before it splits into colors, the whole spectrum present at once, each tone distinct yet inseparable from the radiance itself. This matters because it quietly flips a belief many of us carry in our bodies, the belief that the divine is over there and you are down here, separated by distance, impurity, or unworthiness. In this map, separation is not the starting point, differentiation is. And the difference between those two words is the difference between shame and wonder. The aeons are not angels in a chain of command, not winged employees waiting for orders from a distant monarch. They feel more like cosmic qualities of intelligence and aliveness, luminous principles that express the invisible spirit through Barbello's first mirror. When the texts speak of pairs, unions, or syzygies, it's not romance in a human sense, it's balance, complementary forces generating new clarity, like inhale and exhale, giving birth to rhythm. And if you've ever felt torn between opposites in your own life, wanting freedom and craving safety, longing for intimacy and fearing exposure, this language lands in you with a strange tenderness, as if the cosmos itself understands that polarity is not a mistake, it's a creative engine. Within this unfolding, many Gnostic writings place a figure called autogenes, the self-born, sometimes associated with Christ as a cosmic principle rather than a historical biography. Think of autogenes as the pattern of awakening itself, the capacity of consciousness to recognize its own light without losing itself in the recognition. Not an idol to cling to, but a kind of inner function, the part of you that can wake up inside the dream and say, quietly, I'm here. Alongside this, there is Sophia, wisdom, not as a dry concept, but as living curiosity, the desire of the divine mind to taste itself through experience. In ordinary life, we are told curiosity is dangerous. It gets you in trouble. It makes you question things you're supposed to accept. But in the pleroma, Sophia's curiosity is portrayed as sacred fire. And if you've ever had that feeling that you were born with questions that no one in your environment could answer, questions that made you feel too much, too intense, too different, you can sense why Sophia becomes so intimate in this story. She doesn't just represent wisdom. She represents the ache of wisdom when it wants to know more than the rules allow. Some texts describe foundational aeonic structures, sometimes naming 4 primary luminaries or principles, emphasizing illumination, life, understanding, and completion or perfection, like pillars holding up the experience of divine fullness. Don't get hung up on names that shift across manuscripts. Feel what the names are trying to do. Give you a way to imagine a reality where knowing is not a weapon, where life is not earned, where understanding is not domination, where completion is not control but harmony. The pleroma, in that sense, is not an escape fantasy. It's a mirror held up to your nervous system, reminding you what wholeness would feel like if you weren't constantly bracing for impact. And this is where the urgency begins to build, because the myth doesn't stay in the heavens. It descends into the exact sensation many people carry but rarely admit, the sensation of being slightly out of place in the world, like you're living in a beautifully decorated room that still feels wrong, like the furniture is arranged for someone else. The Gnostic story says, gently, you may be sensing a mismatch between realms, a difference between the fullness and the copy. And the moment that difference becomes more than a mood is the moment something happens that the manuscripts describe with a kind of trembling honesty, the first crack. In the pleroma, emanation follows balance, mutuality, resonance, but Sophia, moved by a longing so intense it becomes almost lonely, begins to reach for something beyond the established rhythm. Not necessarily in rebellion, not as sin in the moralistic sense, but as an experiment in creative autonomy. Imagine being part of a vast choir for ages, singing in perfect harmony, then one day hearing a note inside you that no one else is singing, a note that feels like your own, and you want to know what happens if you follow it all the way to the end. That's Sophia's moment. She wants to know the invisible Father directly, without mediation, without the balancing counterpart, without the usual pairing through which new aeons unfold. Some versions portray this as passion, others as yearning, others as boldness. But the emotional core is familiar, the desire to touch the ultimate on your own terms, without permission. If you've ever felt the urge to step outside the roles assigned to you, to stop inheriting answers and find your own knowing, you already understand Sophia more than you think. And then the story pivots into its most unsettling revelation. Sophia's solitary projection does not produce another luminous aeon in the same way. Instead, it gives rise to something distorted, an entity that is real enough to have power, but limited enough to be blind to what birthed it. The name that often appears is Yaldabaoth, sometimes described with imagery of arrogance, ignorance, even a kind of cosmic brashness. Again, hold this as mythic psychology as much as metaphysics. Yaldabaoth is what happens when a fragment of light is cut off from the memory of the fullness. He cannot see the realms above him, so he assumes there are none. He cannot perceive source, so he mistakes himself as source. And that is not just a cosmic plot twist. It is a mirror of a pattern that repeats in human life. When awareness forgets the depth it comes from, the ego rushes in to fill the gap with certainty. When we cannot see beyond our current conditions, we declare our current conditions final. When we cannot feel the larger field, we build a little kingdom in our mind and call it reality. Yaldabaoth, in this symbolic reading, is the voice that says, this is all there is, not because it's evil in a cartoon way, but because it's terrified of what it cannot comprehend. The texts describe him generating rulers, Archons, not as a pantheon of cute villains, but as mechanisms of management, a hierarchy that maintains a certain kind of reality through structure, repetition, and control. You can almost feel how this lands psychologically, an inner bureaucracy of fear, craving, shame, distraction, the constant pressure to comply with scripts you didn't write. Whether you interpret Archons as metaphysical beings or as mythic symbols for the forces that keep consciousness asleep, their function is the same. They keep the story small. They keep you identified with the most surface layer of yourself. They keep you too busy, too reactive, too hungry, too scared, too entertained to ask the dangerous question, who is the one experiencing all this? Now, here's a subtle but important nuance to keep the tone open rather than combative. The Gnostic manuscripts often contrast this limited creator figure with the ultimate source, and some readers connect Yaldabaoth to the jealous, command-driven deity imagery found in certain biblical passages. But you don't have to turn that into an attack on anyone's faith to feel the psychological sting of the comparison. You can simply notice the difference in emotional texture. One image of divinity feels spacious, silent, ungraspable, not needing your fear. The other feels reactive, demanding, threatened, needing your compliance. And if you've ever wrestled with religious ideas that made you feel smaller rather than more alive, if you've ever sensed a gap between the love you intuit and the control you were taught, this story presses right on that bruise. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It asks you what kind of God image awakens your soul versus what kind of image tightens your chest. That's the illusion of authority the texts quietly expose, that the loudest voice is not always the deepest, that a being claiming to be ultimate may be revealing its limitation in the very act of claiming. And once that suspicion enters your system, it's hard to unfeel it, because you start noticing how often authority performs itself through certainty, punishment, and exclusivity. You can begin to see why knowledge like this would be considered dangerous in certain historical climates, why communities that centered direct inner knowing could be treated as threats, why texts could be destroyed, buried, hidden, passed hand to hand like contraband. Not because the story is true in a courtroom sense, but because it changes what you are willing to kneel to. Here is where the cosmology begins to touch your daily life with a sharper edge. The Gnostic map suggests that the material cosmos we inhabit is not the fullness itself, but a kind of imitation, a lower-order construction shaped by partial perception. There's an image that captures this perfectly. Imagine a forger painting masterpieces without ever seeing the originals, working only from faint impressions, scraps of memory, echoes of beauty. The result might still be impressive, but something is off. The colors don't sing the same way. The proportions carry a subtle strain. The atmosphere feels heavier. In the myth, Yaldabaoth creates a world with boundaries, with ceilings and floors, with rigid laws that compel rather than invite. In the Pleroma, creation is overflow, organic, luminous, like fragrance released by a flower simply by being what it is. In the lower realm, creation feels mechanical, enforced, like gears grinding. And if you've ever felt that life is beautiful but also oddly constricting, like you're living inside systems that don't care about your soul, you can feel why this framing hits so hard. It gives language to a wordless intuition, the sense that something about the world is arranged to keep you forgetful, not only through suffering, but through distraction. Not only through pain, but through endless noise. Yet the story is not trying to make you hate the world. That would be another trap, another reactive certainty. The more surprising invitation is to see the world as a classroom of perception, to learn to distinguish the copy from the original without despising the copy, to learn to live here while remembering you come from somewhere deeper than here. Because the next revelation, the one that turns this from cosmic horror into intimate hope, is that Sophia's essence does not vanish. It becomes embedded. A spark is scattered into the human experience. And if that spark is real, as symbol or as spiritual memory, then the rest of the map is not about doom, it's about awakening. It suggests that the ache you feel, the longing for something beyond, the moments when you sense a presence behind your thoughts, are not glitches. They are signals from the part of you that remembers the fullness. And in part 3, that spark becomes the center of the story, because now it's no longer about what happened in the heavens. It's about what is happening inside you, right now, and why the forces that benefit from your sleep work so hard to keep you from noticing the simplest, most explosive truth of all. You are not only in the world is also in you, and somewhere behind your fear there is a memory that refuses to die. If the last part left you with the unsettling image of a world that might not be the original masterpiece, but a shadowed imitation of something brighter, then the next movement of this ancient story becomes intensely personal, because the Gnostic writers did not believe humanity was placed here as helpless spectators inside that shadow. They believed something far more mysterious happened when Sophia's luminous essence descended into the lower realms. It did not simply vanish, it scattered. and some of those fragments became woven directly into human consciousness itself. This is the quiet secret the manuscripts hint at again and again. Within the human being lives a spark of the same divine intelligence that once shone openly in the pleroma. Not a metaphor meant to make you feel better. Not a reward you earn through moral perfection, but a seed already present, hidden beneath layers of forgetfulness. The texts sometimes call this spark the pneuma, the breath of the divine. And if you pause for a moment and look at your own experience, you can sense why ancient mystics might have reached for language like that. Because there are moments in life when you feel something inside you that refuses to shrink to the size of your circumstances. You might be surrounded by routines, obligations, expectations, systems that define you by what you produce or consume. Yet something within you still looks beyond all that and whispers that there must be more. Where does that whisper come from? Why does it refuse to die, even when everything around you seems designed to drown it out? According to the Gnostic vision, that whisper is the memory of the spark. It is the trace of Sophia herself, embedded within the human story. And once you entertain that possibility, a strange shift occurs in how you look at your own life. The frustration you've felt about the world begins to feel less like weakness and more like intuition. The sense that you don't fully belong to the structures around you stops feeling like alienation and starts feeling like recognition. You are not broken because you question things others accept automatically. You may simply be hearing the faint echo of a deeper home. The ancient writers noticed something peculiar about the human condition. Humans are capable of imagining infinity. Humans create art, philosophy, music, entire symbolic worlds that reach far beyond immediate survival. Humans ask questions that have no practical answer. Why do I exist? What is consciousness? What lies beyond death? No other creature on this planet seems to carry that same restless curiosity, and from a purely material viewpoint, that curiosity can look almost irrational. If survival were the only goal, why would a species spend so much time contemplating the cosmos, the soul, the meaning of existence? The Gnostics answered that puzzle with a mythic insight. Humans ask those questions because something inside them remembers the greater reality from which they came. The spark does not forget completely. It sleeps, but it continues to stir. And the moment it begins to stir more strongly is what the Gnostics called gnosis. This word is often translated simply as knowledge, but that translation is almost misleading. Gnosis is not information you collect from books. It is recognition, a sudden clarity where something deep inside you realizes that the story you have been living inside might not be the full story. Many people describe moments like this in different ways. A sudden stillness during meditation where the usual stream of thoughts falls silent. A moment in nature where you feel a sense of connection so vast it almost frightens you. A sudden insight where everything you thought you knew about yourself rearranges in an instant. These experiences can feel small from the outside, but from the inside they feel enormous, like a curtain briefly opening onto a landscape that was always there but hidden. The Gnostics believed these moments were the spark waking up. But here is where the story becomes more complicated, because the awakening of that spark is not welcomed by every force in the mythic universe. Remember the Archons, the rulers associated with the lower realm created by Yaldabaoth. Whether you see them as literal cosmic beings or symbolic descriptions of psychological forces, their role in the narrative is remarkably clear. They maintain the illusion that the material world is the only reality. They keep human consciousness focused on survival, fear, competition, distraction, and endless consumption. Not because they are cartoon villains plotting evil, but because their entire system depends on humans remaining unaware of their deeper nature. Think about how easily your attention is captured by small concerns. Bills, deadlines, social comparisons, political arguments, the constant scroll of news and entertainment. None of these things are meaningless in themselves, but together they create a kind of fog that fills your mental space from morning to night. In that fog, the deeper question rarely has room to surface. Who am I beyond the roles I play? What is awareness itself? The Archons in Gnostic mythology represent that fog. They represent every structure that keeps consciousness spinning in circles without ever stepping outside the wheel. And the strategy described in the texts is surprisingly simple. Keep people busy enough that they never stop to notice the spark. You can see echoes of this idea in modern life if you look carefully. Entire industries exist to keep attention fragmented. Endless streams of stimulation ensure that silence becomes uncomfortable. Systems of competition ensure that people are always comparing themselves to others, always chasing the next milestone that promises satisfaction but never quite delivers it. None of this requires a conspiracy in the ordinary sense. It is simply the natural behavior of a world built on partial awareness. Yet, despite all this noise, the spark remains impossible to destroy. The Gnostic writers were very clear about this. The Archons can confuse it. They can bury it under layers of distraction, but they cannot extinguish it. And this is where the story begins to feel less like a warning and more like an invitation. Because if the spark cannot be destroyed, then every moment of awareness becomes an opportunity for it to awaken further. The question becomes less about escaping the world and more about seeing through it, seeing the structures that shape your perception, seeing the narratives that define your identity, seeing how often your own mind repeats ideas that were never actually yours to begin with. This kind of seeing is not about rejecting life. It is about becoming conscious within it. The moment you notice your own thoughts, instead of being completely absorbed in them, something subtle shifts. You realize that awareness itself is not trapped inside the thoughts. It is the space in which the thoughts appear. And once that realization begins to deepen, the world starts to feel different. Situations that once seemed overwhelming begin to feel like passing weather patterns. Conflicts that once defined your identity begin to lose their grip. You still participate in life, but you are no longer entirely defined by it. The Gnostics believed this shift was the beginning of freedom. Not freedom in the political sense, but freedom in the most intimate sense possible. The freedom to know what you are beneath the layers of conditioning. And once that knowing begins to grow, something remarkable happens. You begin to recognize the same spark in others. It does not matter whether they are aware of it yet. You can sense that beneath the masks, beneath the roles, beneath the confusion, the same light is present. This recognition transforms how you relate to the world. Instead of seeing others as competitors or enemies, you begin to see them as fellow travelers, each carrying a hidden fragment of the same source. Some are asleep. Some are beginning to wake. Some are already aware but searching for language to describe what they feel. And perhaps this is why teachings like these continue to resurface across centuries, even after being buried, banned, or forgotten. Because once the spark begins to awaken in enough individuals, the story finds its way back into the world. Not through institutions, not through authority, but through quiet conversations, through texts rediscovered in desert caves, through moments of recognition between people who suddenly realize they are not alone in what they sense. Yet the ancient narrative does not stop with the spark itself. Because according to the Gnostic texts, the awakening of the spark was not left entirely to chance. Something else entered the story, something that appears again and again across spiritual traditions under different names. In the Gnostic language, it is called the autogenes, the self-born, and its purpose is simple but profound, to remind the scattered sparks of their origin. To speak a language that the sleeping spark can hear, to reveal that the prison walls are not as solid as they appear. And when this presence enters the story, the myth begins to turn from a tale of cosmic fall into a story of return, because the spark inside you is not alone. It has always been part of a much larger movement of awakening, and the next part of the journey reveals how that movement appears in human history itself, sometimes through teachers, sometimes through symbols, sometimes through quiet moments of realization that change the direction of an entire life. If the previous part awakened the unsettling possibility that a hidden spark lives inside human consciousness, quietly remembering something older than the world we think we know, then the next movement of this ancient story introduces a figure whose purpose is not to create worship, but to awaken recognition. Because according to many Gnostic texts, the monad did not simply watch, as fragments of its own light became scattered through the dense layers of the lower realm. Something responded. Something moved toward the forgotten sparks like a quiet signal sent into deep water. In the secret book of John and related writings, that signal is described as the autogenes, the self-born. The name itself already hints at its nature. It is not born in the ordinary sense. It does not come from the systems that govern the lower world. It arises directly from the divine source, like a reflection of the monad's own awareness entering the field where the sparks have forgotten themselves. To the Gnostics, this presence was sometimes associated with what later traditions would call Christ. But here, the meaning shifts dramatically from what many people have been taught. Instead of a distant savior demanding belief, the Christ principle appears as a kind of awakening intelligence, a living reminder placed within the human story so that consciousness might remember itself. The difference is subtle but enormous. One model says you are fundamentally broken and need rescue from outside. The other suggests that what you truly are has never been broken, only obscured, and what you need is remembrance. When you hear this idea, something inside you might resist, because we have been conditioned to look for authority outside ourselves. We are trained from childhood to assume that truth must be delivered by institutions, by priests, by experts who claim to stand closer to the divine than we do. Yet the Gnostic writings quietly question that structure. If the divine spark truly exists inside every human being, then the deepest teacher would not be the one who demands obedience. The deepest teacher would be the one who helps you recognize the light already present within you. And this is where the figure of Jesus takes on a very different atmosphere within the Gnostic imagination. In these texts, Jesus is not primarily the founder of a religion. He is the revealer of memory. He speaks in ways that point beyond literal interpretation, constantly nudging listeners to look inward rather than upward. When he says, "The kingdom is within you," it is not a poetic metaphor meant to comfort people. It is a direct statement about the location of the divine spark. When he says his kingdom is not of this world, it does not necessarily mean a faraway heaven waiting after death. It suggests that the fullness of divine reality belongs to a different order of consciousness entirely, one that cannot be fully contained by the structures of the material realm. In some Gnostic writings, there is even a strange scene where Jesus is described as laughing at the crucifixion. This detail can sound shocking until you understand the symbolism behind it. The laughter is not cruelty towards suffering. It represents the awareness that eternal consciousness cannot be destroyed by physical death. The body can be harmed, but the spark of divine awareness remains untouched. Those who believed they were destroying the messenger were actually attacking an illusion, because the message itself could not be killed. It continues wherever consciousness awakens to itself. Yet history took a different turn. Over time, the message of inner awakening became reshaped into something far more structured and controlled. The one who had spoken about the divine presence within was transformed into an object of external worship. The emphasis shifted from awakening to belief. Instead of encouraging people to recognize their own connection to the source, many institutions began teaching that humans were inherently sinful and required salvation through obedience to authority. You can see how this inversion changes everything about the spiritual path. In the first model, awakening is intimate. It happens inside your own awareness. In the second model, salvation becomes conditional. It depends on institutions, doctrines, rituals, and intermediaries who claim to stand between you and the divine. The Gnostic perspective does not necessarily demand that you reject every form of organized religion, but it invites you to notice the difference between two very different emotional atmospheres. One atmosphere expands your sense of connection and responsibility for your own consciousness. The other atmosphere reinforces dependency and fear. Once you become aware of this contrast, you begin to see it everywhere. In some teachings, spiritual authority is used to awaken the listener's inner perception. In others, authority is used to replace that perception entirely. The Gnostics warned that the Archons thrive in systems where individuals stop trusting their own capacity for insight. When people believe they are powerless or fundamentally unworthy, they become easier to guide, easier to manage, easier to keep inside the patterns that maintain the existing order. But when someone begins to sense the spark within, something changes. The person who recognizes that spark becomes harder to control, not because they become rebellious for its own sake, but because they begin to see through illusions that once held power over them. The illusion that their worth depends on external approval. The illusion that truth must always come from somewhere outside their own awareness. The illusion that the material world is the final boundary of existence. Awakening does not necessarily make life easier. In fact, it can make life more intense. You start noticing patterns you once ignored. You see systems operating beneath the surface of everyday interactions. You feel the difference between actions driven by fear and actions emerging from genuine clarity. But alongside that intensity comes a new kind of freedom. The freedom of recognizing that your identity is larger than the roles you were taught to play. According to the Gnostic map, this awakening of the spark is not an isolated event. It is part of a larger movement within consciousness itself. Every time a human being begins to question the assumptions of the world around them, every time someone seeks deeper understanding rather than easy answers, the ancient story continues. The autogenes, the self-born principle of awakening, appears again and again through individuals who remind others of their deeper nature. Sometimes these individuals become famous teachers whose words echo through history. Other times they are quiet figures whose influence is felt only by a few people whose lives they touch. But the pattern remains the same. The message is always a variation of the same invitation. Remember who you are beneath the surface of your conditioning. Remember that awareness itself is not limited by the narratives imposed upon it. Remember that the divine spark within you is not something you must earn. It is something you must recognize. When that recognition deepens, the world begins to look different. The structures that once seemed absolute start to appear temporary. The fears that once defined your choices lose their authority. Even suffering begins to shift in meaning. Instead of feeling like meaningless punishment, it becomes part of the process through which awareness learns to see itself more clearly. And this is where the story approaches its most intimate question. If the spark exists within you, if the messenger's role is to awaken that spark, and if the structures of the world are not the ultimate reality they appear to be, then what does it actually mean to return to the source? The final part of this journey does not describe an escape from the world. Instead, it describes a transformation in how you inhabit it. Because the return to the monad, according to the Gnostics, is not a distant event waiting at the end of time. It begins the moment consciousness recognizes itself as more than the roles it has been assigned. And that recognition can start in the most ordinary moment of your life, perhaps even in the quiet space where you are listening right now. If the previous part left you with the unsettling yet liberating idea that the messenger's role was never to create followers, but to awaken recognition within you. Then the final movement of this ancient map turns inward even more deeply, because the Gnostic vision does not end with a cosmic drama somewhere in the heavens. It ends with a question that lands quietly in the center of your own life. What does it actually mean to return to the source? For many spiritual traditions, the answer is often imagined as an escape, a distant heaven reached after death, a final reward granted to those who lived according to certain rules. But the Gnostic writings hint at something more subtle and more immediate. The return does not begin after death. It begins the moment awareness starts remembering what it is. In that sense, the journey back to the monad is not a physical movement through space. It is a shift in perception. The spark within you does not need to travel anywhere. It needs to awaken. And when it awakens, even slightly, the entire landscape of your experience begins to transform. The Gnostics describe this awakening through what they sometimes called stages of ascent, not as rigid steps on a ladder, but as deepening layers of recognition. The first stage is gnosis itself, that quiet but powerful moment when you realize you are not identical with the surface identity you've always assumed you were. You begin to see that the thoughts moving through your mind are not the same thing as the awareness observing them. Your emotions arise and fall like weather patterns, but something within you remains steady enough to witness them. This realization can feel almost shocking at first, because it breaks a lifelong habit of identification. For years, perhaps decades, you have said, "I am angry, I am afraid, I am successful, I am a failure." But when gnosis begins to appear, those statements shift slightly. You start to notice that anger is something appearing in you, fear is something appearing in you, success and failure are experiences moving through you. They are not the core of what you are. That distinction might sound small, but it changes everything. Because once you recognize that awareness itself is not confined to the roles and stories you have inherited, you begin to sense the presence of something far larger than the personality you present to the world. The Gnostics believed that this recognition weakens the influence of the Archons, those forces that keep consciousness trapped in cycles of distraction and fear. As long as you believe you are only the surface identity shaped by society, the system of control works effortlessly. Your attention remains focused on survival, competition, approval, and the endless chase for validation. But when awareness begins to step back from those patterns, their power starts to dissolve. You can still participate in the world, still work, love, create, and struggle like everyone else. Yet you are no longer completely absorbed in the drama. A deeper stillness begins to accompany your actions. The second stage of awakening, described in various symbolic ways across the texts, involves learning to move through the different states of consciousness without becoming trapped by them. In daily life, you can feel how many different inner environments you move through. Anxiety has its own atmosphere, so does anger, desire, boredom, inspiration. Each state carries its own logic, its own sense of urgency, its own story about what matters most. When you are caught inside one of these states, it feels like the entire world is shaped by that emotion. But the more awareness deepens, the more you begin to notice that these states are temporary landscapes passing through a larger field of consciousness. You can feel anxiety without becoming completely defined by it. You can observe anger without letting it dictate every decision. This does not mean suppressing emotions or pretending they do not exist. It means recognizing that the awareness witnessing them is more spacious than the emotions themselves. In Gnostic symbolism, this growing clarity was sometimes described as passing through layers of the cosmos, moving beyond the influence of the Archons, who govern the lower realms of perception. But the language is symbolic. It describes an inner transformation rather than a physical journey through space. The third stage brings the individual awareness into closer alignment with what the texts call barbello, the first expression of divine self-awareness. At this point, the boundary between personal insight and universal intelligence begins to soften. Creative ideas appear more fluidly. Solutions arise in unexpected ways. Moments of synchronicity become more noticeable, as if the world itself is responding to the clarity of your perception. From the outside, it may look like intuition or creativity. From the inside, it feels like participating in a current that was always present but previously obscured by noise. The Gnostics did not describe this as becoming special or superior to others. In fact, the deeper the awakening, the less interest there is in proving anything to anyone. The focus shifts from ego-driven achievement to quiet participation in the unfolding of life. You become less concerned with defending a fixed identity and more interested in exploring the movement of awareness itself. Finally comes what the texts sometimes call reunion with the source. But here again the language can be misleading if taken literally. Reunion does not mean that the individual disappears or dissolves into nothingness. Instead, it means recognizing that individuality itself was never separate from the larger field of consciousness. It is like a wave realizing it is part of the ocean while still continuing to move as a wave. Your unique perspective does not vanish. It becomes an expression of something far deeper than personal history alone. Living from this awareness does not remove you from the world. It changes how you engage with it. Work becomes an opportunity to express clarity rather than simply a struggle for status. Relationships become encounters between sparks of the same source rather than transactions based on fear or dependency. Even challenges and losses take on a different texture. They are still painful at times, but they no longer define the entire meaning of existence. The deeper awareness remains present beneath the changing circumstances. The Gnostics often emphasize that the monad itself does not judge your progress. The source is not standing somewhere outside the universe keeping score of your spiritual achievements. The journey of awakening is not about becoming worthy of divine love. It is about recognizing that the essence of that love has always been present within consciousness itself. And this realization can bring a surprising sense of peace. You begin to see that the search for validation that once drove so much of your life was built on a misunderstanding. The spark within you was never incomplete. It was only temporarily hidden beneath layers of distraction and fear. This is why teachings like those found in the Nag Hammadi texts continue to resonate with people even centuries after they were buried in the desert. They do not demand blind belief. They invite personal recognition. They suggest that the ultimate mystery of existence is not locked away in distant heavens or controlled by exclusive institutions. It is present in the very awareness through which you experience this moment. The return to the monad, then, is not a dramatic escape from reality. It is a gradual unveiling of what reality has always been beneath the surface of appearances. Every moment of attention, every moment of clarity, every moment when you step out of the mechanical patterns of thought and simply observe awareness itself, the return is already happening. And perhaps that is the most radical suggestion hidden within the Gnostic vision. You are not a stranger trying to reach the divine from the outside. You are a fragment of the divine remembering itself from within. The spark that stirred when you first heard this story was not responding to something foreign. It was responding to the quiet recognition of its own origin. And once that recognition begins, even in the smallest way, the ancient map stops being a distant myth. It becomes a mirror in which the journey of consciousness continues to unfold through you. By now you have quietly walked through a long and unusual landscape of ideas, images, and symbols that the ancient Gnostic texts once carried through hidden manuscripts and whispered teachings. You have heard about the monad, the silent and immeasurable source beyond every name, and the first reflection of that mystery through Barbello, the awakening of awareness recognizing itself. You have glimpsed the vast fullness the texts called the pleroma, where qualities like wisdom, life, truth, and understanding appear not as distant abstractions, but as living expressions of a deeper unity. And you have followed the turning point of the story, where Sophia's longing to know the source directly created a fracture in that harmony, giving rise to a world that feels beautiful yet strangely incomplete, a realm where consciousness sometimes forgets where it came from. None of this has been offered as a doctrine you must accept, or as an argument you must defend. It has simply been laid before you as a map once preserved by people who were trying to describe a mystery they sensed within themselves and within the structure of existence. And if certain parts of this journey stirred something quiet in you, a feeling of recognition that is difficult to explain, that feeling itself may be the most important part of the experience. Because the story has always suggested that the deepest knowledge does not arrive as external proof, but as an inner remembering that unfolds slowly and gently over time. If at any moment you felt that the questions raised here were somehow connected to your own life, your own search, your own sense that reality might hold more depth than it first appears, then nothing about that response is accidental. It simply means that something within you was listening in a different way, not with the need to agree or disagree, but with the quiet curiosity that has always guided human beings toward deeper understanding. And there is no hurry in that process. No one is late to it, no one is disqualified from it, and no one is forgotten along the way. Every path of reflection, every season of doubt, every moment of clarity or confusion becomes part of the unfolding movement through which awareness learns to see itself more clearly. So as this exploration gently comes to rest, there is nothing you need to hold tightly and nothing you need to resolve tonight. The ideas can simply remain where they are now, like distant constellations that reveal their patterns slowly when the sky grows quiet enough. What matters most is that the journey you have been walking, the questions you have been carrying, and the subtle shifts you may have felt along the way all belong exactly where they are in this moment. And if the sense of mystery that opened at the beginning of this story still lingers a little in your mind, you may find that the next conversation waiting just beyond this one continues to unfold another small piece of the same ancient puzzle. As I sit with the story we've just walked through, one feeling lingers more than any conclusion, the sense that these ancient Gnostic ideas are less like rigid answers and more like a mirror quietly held up to the human experience. Whether someone reads them as mythology, spiritual symbolism, or simply as poetic attempts to describe the mystery of consciousness, there is something strangely intimate about them. They speak about a hidden spark, about forgetting and remembering, about a world that sometimes feels beautiful yet incomplete, and about a quiet pull inside us that keeps asking deeper questions. And if you're honest with yourself, maybe parts of that story felt familiar in ways that are difficult to explain. Maybe you've had moments where the ordinary rhythm of life suddenly paused and you sensed something larger, moving quietly behind it all. Maybe you've wondered why certain questions keep returning to you, even when the world around you seems too busy to ask them. That is why I'm curious about your own experience with this journey we've explored together. When you heard about the monad, the spark within humanity, or the idea that awakening might be more about remembering than searching, what did it stir in you? Did it feel distant and symbolic, or did it echo something you have sensed before, but never quite had words for? I would genuinely love to hear your perspective, because sometimes the most interesting part of a story like this is not the narrative itself, but the reflections it awakens in different people. If any part of this exploration resonated with you, you might share your thoughts in the comments. Even something as simple as the words, "I'm still reflecting on this," or "This story stayed with me." Those small signals create a quiet conversation between people who are all exploring these questions in their own way. And if you found value in journeys like this one, you can gently support the channel by leaving a like, subscribing, and staying with us as we continue exploring the forgotten corners of history, philosophy, and hidden spiritual traditions together. Thank you sincerely for spending this time here and for being part of a space where curiosity and reflection are always welcome.